namaskar friends, and welcome. As I said in the last class, now we are moving on to discuss Bharati Mukherjee. Bharati Mukherjee is one of the most prominent writers of Indian diaspora in the post colonial period. And she is different from all the writers that we have discussed till now, in that she has a different take on the lives of diasporic people. In fact, she was ahead of her time. She started writing, under the shadow of V.S. Naipaul, uh, and in the classical diasporic tradition, but soon realized that she is not meant for that, and she cannot really, talk about diaspora in terms of loss, identity crisis, dislocation. In that, she celebrates this fluidity of identity. So, Bharati Mukherjee was born in India, had her early education in India. She was born in Calcutta, um, in a Bengali Brahmin family, and she earned her BA honors and MA in English from India before moving on to writer's works of Iowa, where she earned her MFA degree in 1963, and later on her PhD in comparative literature in 1969. And she always loves to call herself an Indian born American writer, and was always reluctant to use the hyphenation Indian American or Indian American Canadian author. So she was born in India, of course, but later on she settled in America, and she also departed for her heavenly abode from America itself. She was also married to Canadian novelist Clark Blaze, and for almost a decade they both lived in Canada, but her experiences in Canada were not very good, and she faced racial hatred and otherness and discrimination in Canadian society. So, whatever she has written about her Canadian experience is, something that is far from happy, and she has time and again recollected her Canadian experience as one of the darkest phases of her life. So, if we look at her writing, as I said, she is different from, let's say, Anita Desai, Salman Rushdie, and others, in the sense, she is the one who does not look at diaspora as a lost world or kind of migration which results in negative experience. Rather, she always looks at it as an opportunity where people can forge their new identities and can make their lives count. Uh, if we look at her notable works, and again, she has also grown as a writer. She started under the shadow of her own personal experiences, as her first novel, The Tiger's Daughter, followed her life very closely, in which we find that the protagonist, like the novelist herself, travels from India to US for studies, marries a US citizen, comes back to India, and is made to realize that she is not welcome in her own family now that she has transgressed the family norms, and has married Firangi, or a foreigner, against the wishes of her family members. Again, when she comes to India, she realizes that the India that she knew before leaving for US has completely changed, and now she does not find the same kind of emotional connect. At the end of the novel, we find that those are the tumultuous years in Bengal, and there are Naxalite movements and such movements going on. And towards the end of the novel, she is caught in her car while traveling from a hotel, Cathay Continental, to her home, and she just wonders whether she will survive to tell her husband how much she loves him. And at that point in time, the novel ends, and it remains unresolved whether she finally accepts her American life, or she remains caught in that writing mob, very much like being in a state of in betweenness. So, in her first novel, we find that the issue of identity and belonging somehow remains in limbo, and she is also not very sure about her rootedness and belonging, like Tara Banerjee, the protagonist herself. In her second novel, Wife, in which Dimple Das Gupta travels from India to US, we find that she finds it difficult to cope up with the changed cultural reality, and ultimately, she turns violent because it impacts her psyche so much so that she's not really able to cope up with this change, and ultimately ends murdering her husband. However, her third novel, which is considered her masterpiece, Jasmine, and we'll talk about that in another class in detail. This also, in a way, looks at Bharati Mukherjee as a matured novelist who kind of has settled by now and has known what does she want to prove as a diasporic. And we find that she starts celebrating this change of change of location, in that the heroine travels from unknown Punjab village in India to different places and lands in US, and forgetting all about her past, she ventures into her future and grabs all the opportunities that the American society gives her, and much like the writer herself, ends up having a sense of belongingness in American society. The Holder of the World, Leave It to Me, Desirable Daughters, The Tree Bride, they are all very important milestones furthering the diasporic experiences of Bharati Mukherjee. And but one thing is clear to Bharati Mukherjee: the cultural and geographical dislocation not always results in nostalgia and loss, but rather it is also sometimes celebration of new identities. So, if we look at her own identity, and many Indian critics have always criticized her because she sometimes refused to talk about her Indian origin and Indianness, and that was quite disturbing for the Indians who thought it that she downplays her Indian roots, and she does not have any sense of, let's say, belonging or gratitude to her own nation. But then later on, she made it clear she is fighting for a visible space in the American literary landscape, and that she can do only if she projects herself not as a hyphenated writer, Indian American, but like an American writer. So, look at this statement by her. She says, I am the writer I am because I write in North American English about immigrant in the New World. So, she even tries to write in a language which is not like any other Indian English writer. She writes in North American English, and always tries, to look like an American writer with a clear cut American attitude to writing. And the reason behind her insistence on being an American writer rather than an Indian writer in America is that she always fights the establishment of America, and against their notion that all the white people who came to America are the settlers, and all the colored people who came to the land of America. They are sojourners and are supposed to go back. So she has been fighting the American establishment and looking for a visible space in the American literary market, and that is another reason why she always presses for that. On being an American writer in 2008, she says, and I quote, "I came to a profound conclusion. I was no longer Indian in mind or spirit. The weight of tradition, even the multifarious tyrannies of a loving family, was no longer tolerable to me. It became clear to me, another door opening, that I was an immigrant writer in the tradition of other, older European immigrant group." So she herself, uh, admits that her sensibility has completely changed, and she no longer thinks like an American or like an Indian, and she no longer thinks like going back. So the same kind of emotional pool that other people feel is not there in her, and that is why she uh, deems it a kind of dishonesty to think or pretend like that, and that is why she always insists on her American identity. In an interview with Amina Mir in 1989, she again, says the same thing, and I quote, "I totally consider myself an American writer, and that has been my big battle to get to realize that my roots as a writer are no longer, if they ever were, among Indian writers, but that I am writing about the territory, about the feelings of a new kind of pioneer here in America." So, as I said, she is different from, let's say, Anita Desai or Salman Rushdie or V.S. Naipaul, in that they always look at the phenomenon of diaspora as in the sense of loss, dislocation, and identity crisis. But we find that Bharati Mukherjee looks at it as a possibility of refashioning oneself and assuming new roles, new identities, and grabbing new opportunities, refashioning their sensibility and life as such, as it happens with most of her characters. So she looks at diaspora as a celebration of life rather than, a loss of a home, loss of a self, or a space, a contested space where, your two halves are always pulling and pushing. And that is the reason, she does not give enough time to her characters to really reflect poignantly on their Indian past. So, in another interview with Alison Cobb, she dissociates herself with the writers like Anita Desai, R.K. Narayan, and V.S. Naipaul, as she says, "I do not write in Indian English about Indians living in India. My role models, view of the world, and experiences are unlike. I am unable to identify with them because they describe characters who fit into their community in different ways than my naturalized Americans fit into communities in Queens or Atlanta." So she says that since she has different, set of characters, different settings, different objectives as a writer, she talks about experiences that are drastically different from the experiences that all these Indian writers talk about. So she would not like to see her characters, hankering after a lost home in a lost country and be a permanent, misfit in the country, in the host country. Rather, she would like to promote a certain kind of resilience in her characters, who will send down their roots wherever they go and will refashion their identity, will be resilient, will be progressive. So that's what she says. That's what she says makes her a different writer when it comes to look at her writing and comparing herself to other Indian English writers. When we look at her novels, as I explained, her Tiger's Daughter, her debut novel, follows Tara, the protagonist, as she returns to India only to experience a deep cultural shock. The Calcutta and West Bengal she once knew have changed drastically, leaving her feeling disoriented and alienated, and all her efforts at coming back to India in search of her emotional connect that is shattered. And ultimately we realize that the writer Bharati Mukherjee intends us to look at this phenomenon as something regressive. So rather than looking back to your own country, you should look forward and grab hold of all the possibilities that are being offered to you in the new world. So Tara Banerjee, is found guilty of looking back, emotionally vulnerable, while in America, even after marrying an American, she longs to go back to India, thinking that you know India will provide her an emotional anchor. But when she comes back to India, she realizes that that India that she knew is dead for her, and her own gaze at India has changed, and now she is looking at it from the borrowed spectacles of, let's say, tourist visiting India, and she distances herself. So rather than living at home amidst all those people she calls families, she prefers to spend her time in Cathay Continental Hotel, which provides her some sense of order and takes her to her safe domain, resembling her American elite thinking. In Wife, as I said, it portrays the story of a traditional Indian woman who migrates to New York City, but she struggles with intense isolation because her husband is working, she is not working, she is left at home all the time. She is watching television, and she is not confident of her language, or she has never been raised in such a way that she is able to um, walk out on her own and mix with local population. So this cultural dislocation in the host country results in her psychological turmoil, and ultimately she ends up murdering her husband, and this novel ends in disaster. So Bharati Mukherjee seems to send a clear message that while in Rome, do as the Romans do. If you don't do that, obviously you will not survive. So had Dimple adopted the American lifestyle, had she been encouraged by her husband to take up some job or get out of her confines of her house, probably that could have resulted in her better settlement, and she could have survived. But then their way of living, which is very much a ghetto living in US, does not really help, and ultimately ends in disaster. Jasmine, as I said, is the masterpiece of Bharati Mukherjee, in which a Punjabi widow, widowed at the age of 17, she reinvents herself in America after fleeing trauma in India. From rural victim to empowered immigrant, she undergoes multiple identity transformations. Jyoti, Jasmine, Jace, Jen, embodying resilience and the fluidity of self in a new cultural landscape, and in a way turns out to be the mouthpiece of the writer herself, who has always been proud of American melting pot and believes that there is no point clinging to a world which is lost to you. Rather, the best thing would be to assimilate into the new one and carve a new identity for yourself. So she does not believe in living in the state of in betweenness, rather, she believes in completely assimilating. The Older of the World is a metafictional saga blending past and present. Also talks about virtual reality. The novel traces Hannah Easton, a 17th century Puritan woman who becomes a Mughal emperor's lover, and then the asset hunter who traces her genealogy with her in the 20th century. And it's a very engrossing tale of migration and refashioning of self in a different land. So again, this again furthers the diasporic vision of Bharati Mukherjee. In Leave It to Me, Devra Di Martino, or Devi, is an adopted American who discovers her Indian origins and reinvents herself as Devi to unravel her past. The novel delves into fractured identities and the search for belonging, set against a backdrop of counter-cultural 1960s America. So, in her novel Desirable Daughters, Tara Chatterjee, a divorced Indian American, confronts family secrets after her sister's death, revealing hidden histories of migration and betrayal. The narrative explores diasporic identity, tradition, and the tension between old and new worlds. So, we find that throughout, Bharati Mukherjee deals with the diasporic subject, but with a difference in that diaspora in her hand turns out to be a space of celebration and growth rather than space where people are suffering loss of identity and identity conflict. So, she prefers transformation over exile, as she rejects victimhood in diaspora narratives, as we have seen in many of the writers. It is the victimhood that is in the forefront. Um, in Bharati Mukherjee's novels, we find how her protagonists often set their old selves to actively embrace new identities, sometimes even reinventing their moral frameworks. For example, in Jasmine, the titular character transitions from a submissive Punjabi village girl to a confident, assertive American woman, and each name that she takes up, Jyoti, Jasmine, Jaji, Jace, Jen, uh, marks a new phase of her diasporic journey, and ultimately, uh, there is complete assimilation that has been hinted at. Another very important thing is that she always talks about female agency and identity, and unlike the passive nostalgic women of traditional diasporic literature, her women are bold, sexually autonomous, and fiercely adaptive, and they challenge patriarchal, cultural, and racial boundaries in pursuit of self definition. Like, if we look at Jasmine again, we find that her journey includes illegality, violence, and reinvention, but always on her own terms. And dislocation is not looked at as a loss of a space and identity, rather, it is looked at as an empowering agent in Bharti Mukherjee. Her characters, often reject roots in favor of reinvention, and so they don't cling to the tradition, much like their, you know writer herself, because she also did the same thing. She went against the tradition of her family, uh, chose her own marriage partner, who was not from India but from Canada. In one of her interviews, she said that, before going to US, she was never allowed to even, study in a co-educational institute. So she came of a very traditional stock, and when she landed in America, she found that the society was completely different, and it accounted for cultural shock initially. But when she recovered, she made her decisions, and so she tried to make a sense of her existence in America, and so she started celebrating this transformation, rather than thinking of a past that she had left behind. So you know even her characters always talk about a redefinition of home as a fluid, self defined space, rather than you know a fixed space. So hybridity and new American identities, they are very much part of her world. Mukherjee believed in embracing the American melting pot as opposed to preserving ethnic enclaves. So she creates characters who are assimilated, who are not on the edges but ready to dive and dissolve and refashion themselves, or transform themselves in the American culture. So in that we can say that she contrasts with the writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, who depict cultural tension and ambivalence more conservatively and try to forge workable solution to the problems of their uh, characters. So her vision, although she writes before Jhumpa Lahiri and Divakaruni, but her vision is more radical, as her characters often erase or overwrite their past. So, if we look at Bharati Mukherjee, uh, although she is dealing with the themes of diaspora, but she is different in the sense she celebrates diaspora and the uh, infinite opportunities diaspora extends to the diasporic subject, and is a true representative of post colonial diaspora, in which we find lot of skilled workers from India, engineers, doctors, educational professionals, undertake a journey to the first world in search of greener pastures. So you know in her fiction, Bharati Mukherjee handles Western themes and settings, as well as characters who are westernized or bicultural, yet she is forced to admit that the very structure of her imagination is essentially Hindu and essentially moral as well. So, like, one thing is saying that you want to be called an American author, much like the other authors who landed in America. That may be a political statement, because Bharati Mukherjee was fighting against the American establishment for uh, parity with all other writers who were treated as settlers, as against writers like her who were treated as sojourners. So that is another thing, but nonetheless, one could always see her clad in her Indian dress, look like an Indian, talking about Indians, and informing her creative world with Indian characters, and in embedding them with Indian mythology and Indian tradition. So there are references of Indian mythology in her novels, and so quintessentially, although her stance as a writer is different, quintessentially we can say that her imagination remains Indian. In her early novels, particularly The Tiger's Daughter and Wife, diasporic characters are backward looking. Fine. So, why? Because they are still nostalgic about their life in India, and this, in a way, talks about Bharati Mukherjee's early reaction to her migration to America, when she was still looking back to India as a reference, as an emotional anchor. But later on, she came out of this nostalgia, and showed more maturity and resilience, and thought of the futility of living on the strings that are barely connected to the homeland. And that is why, in Jasmine, she created a character who crosses borders, and despite all odds is resilient enough to survive and make her journey count. So, apart from that, in her other writings as well, we find how she celebrates this multicultural diasporic space where the characters refashion themselves and take full advantage of their dislocation, rather than looking at it as something that is crippling. So, especially her award winning short story collection, Middleman and Other Stories, that was awarded the National Book Critics Circle Award in 1988. It talks about the stories of such characters who believe in the fluidity of identities, who don't really are cringy about tradition, and believe in floating their life and reshaping themselves and their consciousness. Darkness, however, is an outcome of her dark or sad, disappointing experiences in Canada, and that's why the stories of darkness talk about the feelings of racial otherness and racial hatred in the Canadian society. So Bharati Mukherjee, has always been very critical of uh, Canadian society, although Canada adopted multiculturalism as its national policy. Still, uh, the reality was something else, in that all the cultures were not allowed to flourish on the similar terms, and the colored people were always singled out and were racially othered. So Bharati Mukherjee herself, suffered that, and when she talks about her Canadian phase of life, she says how she was rendered invisible despite being so talented. Her talent, her writings, they were not recognized by people there, and that is why she decided to make a move to America, which was much more accommodating and welcoming. And she believes that America transformed him, and she became the writer that the world knows is because of America. So, regarding her early novels, Jan states that Mukherjee's novels are representative of expatriate sensibility. She makes a difference between expatriates and immigrants, and she says that expatriates are those individuals who are backward looking. Okay, so they are analeptic, they are looking backward, in that they still find themselves more attached to their homeland and live in the ghettos, and it does not really help them in the new land because they don't march ahead. So she is critical of that, and her earlier novels like Tiger's Daughter and Wife might be called novels of expatriate sensibility, but with Jasmine, she ventures into the world of immigration. Immigrants are those who are forward looking or proleptic, and they are always looking at the possibilities and opportunities that are thrown at them in the host land. So rather than pumping and parodying their pain of exile, they exult in their newfound status and new identity in a new country. So, in that phase only, Mukherjee associated herself with V.S. Naipaul as an expatriate writer, as in her non-fiction Days and Nights in Calcutta, which was co-authored with her novelist husband Clark Blaze, she says, "In myself, I detect a pale and immature reflection of Naipaul. It is he who has written most movingly about the pain and absurdity of art and exile, of third world art and exile among the former colonizers, the tolerant incomprehensible of hosts, the absolute impossibility of ever having a home, a this." But later on, she outgrows her models and she finds a new model in the Jewish immigrant writer Bernard Malmert. And she says that now I identify myself more with Malmert, who talks about celebrating the diasporic life rather than parading and pumping the pain of separation and dislocation. So she rejects her earlier stance of expatriate and sees herself as an immigrant. So she herself says in Darkness, the short story collection that is based on her, life and experiences in Canada, that if you have to wonder, if you keep looking for signs, if you wait surrendering little bits of a reluctant self, ever retreating past, you will never belong anywhere. So, she believes that in order to belong to a new place, you need to leave behind your old place. Susma Tandon, in the conclusion of her book Bharati Mukherjee's Fiction, a Perspective, states, and I quote, "She saw in immigration an opportunity to redefine herself as an artist in an immigrant tradition and not as an aloof and alienated expatriate writer concerned only with the subversive potential of life on the margin." Um, you know, in her essay, Immigrant Writing, Give Us Your Maximalist, she advocates for a bold, expansive, and emotionally rich style of immigrant literature, and she defines this style of writing as maximalist or expansionist rather than restrictive and parochial. Again, this was one of her advocacies for seeking a visible space, a pronounced space in the American literary market. She critiques the dominance of minimalist writing in American fiction, which she associates with a narrow, insular focus on mainstream narratives that lack transformative power. So she dismisses this minimalist fiction as clever, mannered, brittle, and incapable of capturing the psychic violence of immigration or the globalized world's complexity. And she describes the maximalist individual as someone who relinquishes former identities and languages in order to fully embrace a new cultural and social reality rather than being confined to a static sense of self. Maximalists are defined by their openness to transformation and their readiness to adapt to the evolving dynamics of their adopted homeland. And this maximalist uh, credo developed by Bharati Mukherjee, in a way, discloses her philosophy as a diasporic writer, where time and again she says that one has to open up, one has to grow, one has to set oneself free and expand one's horizons rather than living in a closed space, being slaves to their traditional cultural conservative pools and demands. In her memoir Days and Nights in Calcutta, as I said, it was co-authored with her husband Clark Blaze. She describes her and Clark's perspective towards India, and this was written after their visit to India in 1973. The first half is written from Blaze's point of view, while the second half is written from Mukherjee's own perspective. Clark Blaze's section deals with the cultural dissonance, how a Westerner navigates India's traditions, social hierarchies, and familial expectations. His narrative highlights the alienation of an outsider in a densely layered Indian society, while Mukherjee's section highlights her encounter with her romanticized memories of India against the realities of post colonial upheaval, political unrest, and so on. She critiques the oppressive social structures and reflects on her identity as an expatriate turned outsider. And she says, in India, I had been a good daughter. In Canada, I was a free woman. India had changed, but so had I. The two versions of myself no longer fit. So we find that Bharati Mukherjee, uh, as a writer, is different from the writers that we have talked till now, in that she looks at the positive aspect of diaspora, as many people post independence, post liberalization, look at it as diaspora as a space which provides them with lot of growth and development opportunities. So we will discuss Bharati Mukherjee's Jasmine and another novel in the coming classes. And before I leave and refer to the references, dear friends, I'm very happy to share with you that you know I myself happen to be one of the earliest researchers on Bharati Mukherjee, and my book on Bharati Mukherjee is one of the earliest in India. You can see that listed here. Kumar Nagendra, the fiction of Bharati Mukherjee, a cultural perspective. So I have a personal reason also to talk about Bharati Mukherjee, although she forms a very important chunk of this whole course. So, friends, looking forward to your company in the next class as well. And let us look at how the Indian diaspora has shaped uh, through all these writings, as we now see the different versions of diasporic experiences filtered through the imagination of these diasporic writers. So, these are the references. Thank you very much. I look forward to your company in the next class. Thank you very much.